given me quite a task, and I won't be able to cover half of those things. But the first and most important, I think, is to get a good idea of what the Vatican Observatory is. As you heard, I was made the director a year ago. You may not realize that for 20 years the director was an Australian, Daniel O'Connell, who would come from Sydney to direct the observatory, and we survived that, so we'll survive anything. They should survive me. To give you a sense of what the observatory is about, I thought what I would do is show you a little film clip with someone who is far better equipped than me standing up here to give you the truth. Both science and religion are conversations about the universe. They're ways of learning how we interact with this universe. It's not simply a question of, is there a God, but there is a God, now what do we do? It's not just a question of, there are a bunch of stars, but rather, why are there stars? How do they work? How does that tell us how things work here on Earth? The interaction that I see in my own life is that religion gives me the reason to do the science.
Back in the papacy before Francis was Benedict, and one of his lines in a final elocution to the fathers of the general congregation was, go to the frontiers. Well, there isn't much more frontier than 3.7 billion years away.
The first official interest of the Church for astronomy started in 1582 with the reform of the calendar. Then in 1891, Pope Leo XIII wanted to have an observatory to show that the Church is not against science, but the Church promotes good science.
They start out by having telescopes on the Tower of the Winds, and then on the walls surrounding the Vatican, as the city lights grow, and as the Italian government gives them back the territory of Castel Gandolfo. In the 30s, they build new telescopes on the roof of the Papal Palace in Castel Gandolfo, best telescopes of their era in the 1930s. By the 1980s, light pollution makes those telescopes unusable, so we build a new telescope in the dark skies of Arizona.
I'm working in 3 projects. The first one is NEOS, Near Earth Object. So what I'm doing with NEOS is just observe them using our modern telescope VAT. The second project is meteors. I worked on very faint meteors, what we call shooting stars. And the third project is set fireball network. They will have 4 cameras here around Tucson, so that actually we can monitor any fireball getting into the Earth atmosphere in the region.
This telescope, the Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope, it was the first of the new technology telescopes that has been considered pretty much the norm now in developing telescopes. With the advance of computer technology, we have the capability of bringing that advanced technology directly into our telescope. So it's an expandable, it's almost like it's a living machine, so it can grow as technology grows.
It is still very important to maintain scientific research in the Vatican, simply because there is still a lot of confusion about this relationship between science and faith. We are not out here trying to prove the existence of God by looking through a telescope. That's not what we're doing. But we can say that if we want to obtain any reasonable results looking through that telescope, we need to do it embracing a certain work ethics that is, in fact, the same work ethics that the Bible itself tells us through commandments and through the Gospels to embrace.
Human beings look at the stars and wonder. They want to know, what is that? What is that about? How do I fit in? They hear about the moon landing and they want to know, what was that like? If we're part of the human race, we're part of the race that went to the moon. We're part of the species that looked at the stars and wondered, what the heck are those things? Looking at the sky reminds you that there's more to the universe than what's for lunch. What's more, if you believe in a universe that God so loved that he sent his son, then not only are you going to want to study the universe because it's kind of cool, it's an act of worship. It's an act of getting closer to the Creator and getting closer to a universe, as St. Athanasius said 1,500 years ago, was cleansed and quickened by the Incarnation. Then, doing science is an act of worship. It's amazing how profound you can sound when you have a good editor. The whole idea that there was an interest in astronomy is not something modern. You can find a lot of reference to stars in scriptures. I've pulled out just a couple of favorites. Psalm 8, O Lord, our sovereign, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You've set your glory above the heavens, yet when I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon, and the stars that you've established, what are human beings that you're mindful of them? Mortals that you care for them. Yet you have made them a little lower than God and crowned them with glory. A lot of people ask me, you realize how big the universe is, 13.8 billion light years to the edge of what we can see, and who knows how much beyond there. If the universe is so big, there are 100 billion stars in our galaxy, and there are 100 billion galaxies like ours, and you add that up, and that's a lot of zeros. How can God possibly pay attention to me? How can God listen to my prayers? Or you can say, the universe is so big, and I'm so small. The fact that God nonetheless can pay attention to my prayers and your prayers, and I'm not too sure about yours, but your prayers. That tells us just how enormous God really is. Another lovely phrase, this is from the book of Baruch. The stars shone in their watches, were glad, he called them and they said, here we are. They shone with gladness for him who made them. Because that's the other thing about astronomy. It is a source of enormous joy. I don't know anybody who doesn't like to have the chance to go out and look at the stars. The trouble is, if you live in the city, it's hard to see stars anymore. I just finished an 8-day retreat up at Seven Hill, 2 hours north of Adelaide, because there you can see the stars. And that's glorious. I don't know how many... I gave a talk yesterday to a bunch of 7th graders, year 7 students at the local Catholic school. I asked them, which I will ask you, how many of you know where the Southern Cross is? Good. I'm glad that you're learning these things. How many of you have ever seen the Milky Way? Now, if you were to ask school kids here in Sydney, how many of you have seen the Milky Way? What do you think the answer is going to be? Hardly any of them. Pope Benedict had a wonderful homily about 5 years ago saying that light pollution is a marvelous symbol of how we human beings are tempted to use our technology to blind ourselves to the glory that God has made. Just as in our own lives we want to pretend that crippled people don't exist, that people who are hurt don't exist, that people who might be hurt by the things I'm doing don't exist. And we will blind ourselves. In the process, we're blinding ourselves to the glory of God. Because it's precisely in the poor that you find God close to the surface. I learned that in my Peace Corps days, living in Africa. Light pollution robs us of the patrimony that every child ought to be able to have, of having a sky to look up and make yourself wonder. But when you never go outside, or if you make the outside part of the inside by surrounding yourself with useless light, don't get me going on light pollution, I'd be here all day. The real reason the church, of course, is interested in astronomy was not light pollution originally, it was calendars. You wanted to know when to declare feast days. And Pope Gregory XIII, you have a wonderful picture there, constructed a tower. I think there's a circle around it there. And it's called the Tower of the Winds. If you ever go to the Vatican, you look in the Vatican Museum, you can see this little tower. Inside the tower, it's called the Tower of the Winds because there was a mechanical wind vane and these wonderful paintings of the winds. But on the south wall, there is a little putti with his like this, which is actually a hole in the wall. And a beam of light from the sun goes through the wall and makes a spot on the floor. It's actually like a camera obscura. It's really a tiny image of the sun. And if you have a small enough hole in a dark enough room, you can even see sunspots and things, if you know where to look. The position of the sun on that center line changes with the seasons. During the wintertime, the sun is very low, which is why it's chilly. During the summertime, the sun is very high, it can bake you more. And as the sun moves, the position of the spot moves, so you can work out two things. You can work out, first of all, when is the sun at either extreme? That'd be the first day of winter and the first day of summer. And then the halfway part is the first day of spring or the first day of fall. The other thing you can work out is what is your exact latitude by figuring out the angles of the sunlight and the spot on the floor and all of that. There was a fellow named Cassini, who they named a spacecraft for, who used cathedrals to measure the positions of every big town and also to do scientific measurements. If you go to the old cathedrals in Europe, you'll find a number of them, like this one in Bologna, has a line on the floor that is one of these meridian lines that you can use to see, what constellation is the sun when this is made. He made the first accurate map of France doing this, presented it to the King of France, and the king said, "This is terrible. France is a lot smaller than we thought it was. I've lost more territory thanks to you than in all of my wars." But the other thing it was useful for was to remind people why we needed to reform the calendar. And the reform was for two reasons. First of all, it's only an interesting coincidence that the number of days that are in a year and the number of time when, in the modern view, when the Earth is in one spot in the sky and back to the same spot is almost exactly an even number, or a complete number of days. It's 365 and a quarter days. So every 4 years you add a day. Well, it's not 365 and a quarter. It's almost 365 and a quarter. And that almost adds up by about 1 day a century. So that after 1,500 years, Julius Caesar had started this thing. After 1,500 years, they were off by about 10 days. You got to fix it. And they knew that, and this helped understand why he had to fix it and how many days he had to fix it. But the other reason that Pope Gregory called in the Jesuits, this was Christopher Clavius who wrote that book, Cristoforo Clavio, of the Society of Jesus of Bamberg. There was another problem happening in the end of the 1500s, early 1600s. People from Europe were spreading Christianity all over the world. When do you celebrate Easter? And you don't have an easy way to call up and say, is it Easter this Sunday or next Sunday? I forget. The way it had been determined by the Council of Nicaea was the first Sunday after the first, basically it was supposed to be the first Sunday after Passover. Passover is the first full moon after the first day of spring. What happens if that occurs on a Sunday? Is that Easter or is it the Sunday following Easter? And it won't be the Sunday following. What happens if that occurs on a Sunday in one part of the world, but it's a Saturday in a different part of the world? As you're very aware if you have any communication with folks back in America, and I'm trying to say my watch tells me that today's Wednesday. And we all know it better be Thursday. I'm catching a plane on Thursday. What do you do? They finally worked out a mathematical formula that kind of imitates when Easter is going to be. And with this mathematical formula, They worked up, but you remember 2012, the world was going to end because the Mayan calendar ran out? We have a calendar here that's good to the year 5000. And dedicated, so we're good for another several thousand years. And this book, written in 1603, tells you that Easter in 2017 is going to be on the 16th of April. And that's the formula we still use. Now, when I talk about the history of science and religion, I always got to talk about Galileo. All of that occurred before Galileo came on the scene. Clavius, as an old man, got to meet Galileo. Clavius wrote a letter of recommendation for Galileo when Galileo was a young man to get him a job. Galileo had this interesting relationship with the Jesuits. Christoph Scheiner here was the first person, he claimed, to see sunspots. Galileo was the first person to see sunspots, so he claimed. Actually, neither of them were the first. It was a fellow named Thomas Harriot in England. But this started a nasty fight between Galileo and, I could talk for hours on Galileo. I just want you to remember 5 things. Number 1, Galileo remained a devout Catholic even after his trial. The trial was very unfair, should never have happened. 2, Galileo was not convicted of being a heretic. He was not executed. He was not beheaded. He was not, languished in jail. There were 2 different times Galileo was called in. The first time he was given a certificate from Cardinal Bellarmine saying, "You are not a heretic. Anybody who says you are, show them this piece of paper. You get out of jail free card." Didn't work 20 years later when he tried to get out of jail. In his final trial, the book that got him into trouble, he had gotten permission from the Pope's censor to publish. He had done all the things they'd asked him to do. And then a month later, the Pope was horrified. And so Galileo said, "Tell me what to change. I'll change anything you want." And the Pope says, "No, you're going to go on trial, and we're going to find you guilty of something." And at the end of the trial, you say, "So you see, we found you guilty of heresy." And Galileo says, "No, you didn't." And they looked over the records and said, "Okay, well, you have been found guilty of vehement suspicion of heresy." And that's what he was found guilty of. And immediately after, he serves his house arrest in his villa, which is a very nice villa. Now, still, it was unfair. Still, he should not have had to do this. But he wrote one more book afterwards, and he negotiated to have it published in the Protestant North, and nobody got in his way. John Milton came and visited him during this time, which all is to say that the Church was wrong to go after Galileo, but the reasons for doing so are probably not the reasons you think. Everything you know about Galileo is wrong, but the truth doesn't make the Church look any better. You really want to know what the reasons were? Well, what I would do, being a nerd, is to find a good book about Galileo. So I went to Amazon.com and I found every one of these books tells you the truth of what really happened. And they're all different from each other. But of course, if you don't like any of those, then there are also these. And if you don't like those, there are also these. And you get the idea. There are about 400 different books about Galileo. Some people say that, it was a tragic conflict of worldview. All conflicts of worldviews are tragic. That's what tragedy is about. It's 2 people having a different idea of how the world should work, and that's what makes a great story. Most people don't go to trial over it. He was a secret atomic hero. He believed in atoms. Actually, the guy who did believe in atoms was a Jesuit priest, Boscovich, who convinced the Church to accept the Copernican system. He made too many personal... If making personal enemies gets you in trouble with the Church, there would be no Italian who was not in trouble with the Church. Of course, now that I think of it... No Australian either. Right. The philosophers are out to get him. The Jesuits are out to get him. I wish that the Jesuits had that kind of power. His book could have been read as personally insulting the Pope, and maybe that didn't do any good, but the Pope had already accepted it before deciding he was going to get mad. And you probably know among your friends, if somebody has decided that they're going to be mad at you, there's nothing you can do about it except wait it out. Did I mention I only entered the Jesuits when I was 40 and I had a girlfriend before that? Never mind. A lot of people are arguing that, in fact, there was an interesting coincidence. The Galileo trial occurred during the 30 Years' War, at the height of the 30 Years' War, in fact, at the most crucial moments, and that the Pope was under a lot of pressure, and maybe this was some deal he was doing. Who knows? Whatever it was, Galileo, was found guilty of a technicality. He should never have been brought to trial. And the Church, ever since, has praised a lot of what he said about how science and religion works together. It also did not mean the end of science. There was Riccioli, another great Jesuit, wrote a lovely book about, just 20 years after the Galileo trial, about judging between different worldviews, the Copernicus worldview and the Tycho Brahe worldview, and there were a lot of good scientific arguments for and against, and I could talk about those for hours. The one thing I'd like to point out is that in the history of astronomy, Riccioli, in this book, also makes the first accurate maps of the moon, and the most prominent crater on the moon is named Crater Copernicus by a Jesuit priest 20 years after the Galileo trial. And he names other craters for other people, Aristarchus, a ancient Greek, Kepler, Galileo, and, oh yes, himself. All in those part of the world. There are now 35 craters on the moon named for Jesuits, because the guy who made the map was a Jesuit. Not that we have that kind of influence anymore. The International Astronomical Union is now the group that gets to name features on planets. And there is a working group on planetary system nomenclature, and the task group that specifically judges and comes up with names for Mars, the Mars Task Group, I'm the chairman. It's all a Vatican plot. The guy who wrote about Pluto was another Jesuit from the Vatican. Don't get me started on Pluto either. And the point is that the Church has been always happy with the idea that, this is by 1750, here's the ceiling of a Jesuit school in Prague. The guy you heard earlier in the film talking about how we don't look through a telescope to find the existence of God, he's Czech. This is where he studied. And you can see the little angels looking through telescopes, and every star now has a bunch of planets around it. And this is in the Jesuit schools in the 1750s. The idea that there was a war between science and religion only is invented at the end of the 19th century. And it's tied up in American politics to keep those terrible people with vowels at the end of their names from immigrating there. So you don't want Consolmagnos coming and ruining America. It comes from the anti-clerical political movements in Europe. It comes from the fact that in those days, at the end of the 19th century, steam engines and electricity were going to solve all of our problems, and we don't need religion anymore. Well, of course, steam engines and electricity eventually gave us World War I. Maybe we do need religion. But in addition, Darwin had come up with a beautiful description of how species change and evolve. And people took this piece of wonderful science and started reading things into it that were never there, like, the way the world is the result of natural forces, and it's not nice to mess with Mother Nature. So the way the world is includes the fact that I'm rich and you're poor. It's obviously the result of natural forces, and it would be a waste of my money to try to make you rich, because clearly you're meant to be poor. It's called social Darwinism. It happily excused everything of the way the world was and made you not have to worry about trying to make things better. The Church wasn't happy about that. What's even better? We now know through the power of science how to make perfect human beings. What does a perfect human being look like? Strangely enough, it looks just like me. And so if people like me are allowed to breed a lot, and people who look different from me, you see, and after 2 generations, we'd only have people who look like me, and the world would be full of beautiful people. And if you don't think that's true, and this is an actual argument, look at the Irish. My mother was Patricia Clare Duffy. Look at the Irish. You realize how terrible the Irish are? It's because all the smart Irish men become priests. And it's only the stupid ones who have kids. That was the kind of argument they were giving. Well, the church didn't like that either. The church was the only voice speaking out against eugenics at the turn of the century. And everybody said, well, the church must be anti-science. Pope Leo says, no, the church is not anti-science, the church is anti-bad science. And so we will build an astronomical observatory. It's also, we're building telescopes on a wall outside of Rome. And one of those telescopes will be part of an international project. So there are 18 telescopes like this, identical telescopes, used to photograph the sky. And this was part of a big international program. Every national observatory was part of it, to photograph the sky and map the positions of every star to make an atlas of all the stars. Well, who's going to do the mapping? It's very tedious work, but it's very important work, but it's work that takes a lot of care. Clearly, women do that kind of work. This was the 19th century. So the computers who actually did the work for the Vatican were a group of young nuns, the Sisters of the Child Mary. The people at Harvard who did all of the mapping of spectra of stars were also women, because again, it was thought, well, as a result, in astronomy, we've got a wonderful tradition of women, and much more than other technical fields, which still didn't stop me from not being able to get a date when I was a kid, but that's all right. That maybe had nothing to do with... In the 1930s, as you heard, we moved out to Castel Gandolfo. This is the Papal Palace. Palace was built by Pope Urban VIII, that same pope who called in Galileo. And ironically enough, a couple of telescope domes were built there. The top floor, this is the Pope's summer apartment, basically. And the top floor, where the arrow is, that's where my office was for 18 years. And just underneath me was the Pope's bedroom. So for 18 years, I could claim to be the one guy in the Catholic Church above the Pope. The popes were very supportive of the astronomy that was done, the laboratory work that was done there. They all, would come and visit. And as you heard, in the 90s, we built this beautiful telescope in the dark skies. What is some of the science that the Jesuits have actually done? I don't have time for the story, but I'm going to tell it anyway. How many people have been to Rome? How many of you have been to the Church of St. Ignatius in Rome? And you'll remember it because you walk in and it's got this kind of dark, gloomy dome. It's a big Baroque church, a big, dark, gloomy dome. And then you walk under it a little more, and the dome never got built. So instead, what you see that looks like a dome is fake. That picture is actually taken from directly underneath, looking up. It's done in perfect perspective. They ran out of money. They've got the flat roof. The guy who built it, by the way, was one of Galileo's rivals, Orazio Grassi, and this church also happens to be where Cardinal Bellarmine is buried, who was, the guy who gave Galileo the get-out-of-jail-free card. Because there were 4 pillars to hold the weight of a dome, but no dome, in the 1860s, Angelo Secchi, that guy, built telescopes on the roof, being supported by those pillars. They're still there to this day. And from this dome, he was the first person to look at Mars through a good telescope and ask not, where is Mars and how does it orbit, but what is Mars? What's on the surface? What are those dark features? He even uses the infamous word canali that other people misinterpret as canals. He's just talking about dark features. Another thing he did was he got the idea of putting a disk in the telescope to block out the sun, and then you could see the corona around the sun, just like in an eclipse. He actually was the first person to photograph an eclipse, Jesuit priest in the 1860s. His work connected the amount of activity on the sun, the amount of sunspot activity, the amount of coronal activity, with fluctuations of the magnetic fields here on Earth, which turns out to be important really today. If you depend on cell phones, or you depend on long-distance transmission of electric power, you have to know what the sun's doing, because it's going to affect what happens to our electric implements here on Earth. It's so important that NASA has a pair of satellites looking at the sun with an instrument package called the Sun-Earth Connection Coronal and Heliospheric Investigation. I mean, there's fame. You get your name turned into a NASA acronym. I'm still wondering what they're going to do with Consolmagno, but I don't think it's actually ever going to come up. The best thing that Secchi did was he took one of his telescopes and he put a prism in front of the light so that instead of seeing a dot of light in the telescope, you saw a rainbow. And you see that different stars have different lines of color missing because they're made out of different chemical composites. In the 1830s, a French philosopher, Descartes, had said, there is a class of knowledge that we know must exist, but we will never be able to know. For instance, we will never know what a star is made out of. How could we? We could never get to the stars. 30 years later, Secchi is doing exactly that. What's more, by classifying stars, he had 5,000 stars. By classifying them, he's beginning to say, these stars evolve into that, evolve into that. This was the basis of what became the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram and everything that we now call astrophysics. The fundamental shift in science was, science is not about coming up with facts. Most of us learn science until we're about 12, and at 12 you're still memorizing facts. The human brain is 14.3 kilos, whatever. It's not a big book of facts. It's the questions that the facts inspire. And Secchi came up with a new set of questions. The questions not of where are the stars, like those photographs we're making, but what are the stars, and how did they get to be the way they were? He's not the only priest who did cool things like that. You probably know the guy with the wild hair on the left. The guy on the right is a fellow named Millikan. Those of you who have ever studied physics, you know the Millikan drop experiment. This was at Caltech. That was actually the dining room at the Athenaeum. I've had dinner there. Not with these guys. The guy in the Miller with the Roman collar, his name is Georges Lemaitre. Somebody asked me about Georges Lemaitre. Georges Lemaitre was a Catholic priest who also had a doctorate in mathematics from Louvain and a doctorate in astrophysics from MIT, my MIT, so he has to be good. He's the kind of guy who could read mathematical equations the way that you might be able to read poetry. And he's reading Einstein's equations of general relativity. He goes, you realize what this says? This says that the universe is expanding. And not only that, but I can work out from observation how fast the universe is expanding and then work back to where it was all expanding from something that had the same amount of energy but a whole lot smaller space, so a much higher energy density, what we call temperature. And there had to be a beginning point. The other astronomer, no, you're just saying that because you're a priest and you want to have Genesis have a creation story. Go, no, it's what the science says. The other one of the astronomers, Fred Hoyle, gets on the BBC and starts making fun of this idea. He refers to it as that Big Bang Theory. The guy who invented the Big Bang Theory was a Catholic priest. He was not a Jesuit. He hated being called a Jesuit. He wanted to remind people that it is possible to be a smart priest and not be a Jesuit. Rare, but possible. The other person he got in trouble with, though, was the Pope. Pope Pius XII gets up in front of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, there is such a thing, and says, isn't it interesting that, we've been talking about a creation point, now the scientists are agreeing with us. Lemaitre went to the Pope and said, please, Your Holiness, don't do that. Number one, 1,000 years from now it may turn out that I'm totally wrong. You don't want to be tied into any theory of the universe. Number two, that's not what creation really is all about. You know that. Going back to the Church Fathers, when we say that God created out of nothing, an idea that comes out of the book of Maccabees, and it's not a philosopher's idea, it's a mom talking to her son who says, don't be afraid to what the king's going to do to you, because we are the people of the God who created out of nothing, and that God can take care of you. Creation out of nothing doesn't mean something that happened 13.7 billion years ago. Creation out of nothing is continually happening because it is creation by a God who is not tied to time, but is outside of time. Creation occurs now, and the next second after now, and the second before now. God continually wills the universe to continue to exist. A point that gets a lot of people confused. Stephen Hawking, who's actually a member of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, came up with a book a few years ago that says, I figured out how the Big Bang happened. So you see, even when there's a vacuum, according to our best science of the day, which is going to look silly tomorrow, even when there's a vacuum, there's a zero-point energy that's basically the gravity field. And if you wait long enough, there will be quantum fluctuations in the gravity field. And if you wait long enough, one of those quantum fluctuations will be big enough to turn itself into a Big Bang. Therefore, I don't need God. Therefore, God doesn't exist. Now, how many layers of bad logic can you come across? First of all, if you're saying that God is, by my definition, the thing that started the Big Bang, and then you're saying that gravity is the thing that started the Big Bang, you're not saying there is no God, you're saying God is gravity, which I don't think is what he really wanted to say. On the other hand, maybe he thinks of God as gravity. That explains why Catholics celebrate Mass. I can see how many of you have studied science. You can explain it to the rest of them. Well, in spite of those bad jokes, we continue to chat with popes, and we continue to have ideas about how the universe works. There are a lot of other wonderful bits in the history of astronomy. The first photographs of the green flash, the meteorite collection that I work at. We've had popes continue. Pope Benedict was so thrilled to come to my lab, he brought his own white lab coat. It's great. and Francis likewise. You've heard a little bit about the shooting stars from the African Jesuit who's with us. We have a series of lovely telescopes in Rome on the roof of the Papal Palace. Get some marvelous images. We have students from all over the world who come every 2 years. We've got a summer school, and they visit Rome. And then, of course, we have, in Arizona, a place in a nice dark sky far away from any cities where we get our new advanced technology telescope, and I could talk about this for hours. Just to say, it's a lovely telescope. Why do we do it? There's George Lemaitre with his advisor, Arthur Eddington. And some thoughts that popes have given us. Physics can never tell us how we get from something to nothing. The big question, why does existence exist, is the unanswered question that draws us out of what's for lunch and into the bigger, why are we here? Because the unmistakable fact is that we are here. And there's no reason within ourselves why we should be here. This is Wittgenstein says this, that chair has meaning only because there's somebody who can sit in the chair. No thing can have its meaning in itself. Its meaning only comes from something outside itself. If this universe has a meaning, there must be a supernatural. Pope Pius XI wrote that from no part of creation does there arise a more eloquent or stronger invitation to prayer and adoration than in astronomy. It's one of the reasons they support astronomy. And Pope Pius XII, who did listen to Lemaitre and never made that mistake again, man ascends to God by climbing the ladder of the universe. We are physical beings. I'm a material guy living in a material world. There's a song there someplace if I can make it rhyme, but God speaks to me through the things he creates. That's not only why doing science is an act of worship, but as the Pope has reminded us, that is why crimes against the environment are basically graffiti on God's message. This is a fabulous book to read, and I don't have nearly enough time to give it justice in the few minutes that I have here. And it's very approachable, and it's very readable, and if you do read it, don't read what the newspapers say about it. Read the book itself. It's not that hard. The one phrase that jumped out at me is that the problem of climate change is not a problem of technology. It's a problem of human sin. And the fix isn't going to be just technology. I love technology. I went to MIT. The T stands for technology. And I think technology is glorious, and technology gives me the tools to get closer to God. But it's not God itself. The universe is not God itself. The Bible is not God itself. There's a wonderful Jewish folktale, loving the Torah more than God. We can't fall into that mistake. But we have to recognize that the book of nature and the book of Scripture are books that are designed to lead us to God. And it's a crime to fiddle with one or the other to make it say things it doesn't say. The laws of nature are a great incentive to contemplate the works of the Lord with gratitude. So I'll go back to the original question. Why does the Vatican support an observatory?
Why does the Vatican have an astronomical observatory? For instance, you're the curator of meteorites at the Vatican. Well, why do they curate meteorites? Are they looking for the shooting star of David? What?
No, in fact, the whole idea of having astronomers really got started with the reform of the calendar back in the 1500s. And since then, just studying the universe is a great way to remind yourself that there's more important things in life than what's for lunch.
What is for lunch, by the way?
My favorite way of understanding our relationship with the universe is this marvelous quote from Chesterton. It's a riff on Laudato Si, the actual original poem by St. Francis, not Pope Francis. Incidentally, great mystery that I know a lot of you are puzzled about, the title, Laudato Si, S-I and an apostrophe afterwards. It's not a circumflex over the I. It's the Italian word CE, and you drop off one of the I's, so hence you have the apostrophe. Let there be praise. It's the easiest way to translate it. Let it be praised. Chesterton in Orthodoxy writes, the essence of all pantheism, the idea that we should be worshiping nature, the essence of all pantheism is that nature is our mother. The main point of Christianity is this: nature is not our mother, nature is our sister. Nature was a solemn mother to the worshippers of Isis and Cybele, or to Wordsworth and Emerson. But to St. Francis, nature is a sister, and even more, a younger sister, a little dancing sister, to be laughed at as well as to be loved. The real question isn't why does the Vatican have an observatory? Why does anybody have an observatory? Why do we look at the stars? Because they give us joy. And in that joy, we feel a touch of God's presence. Thank you very much, and invite you to read our blog, The Catholic Astronomer, and I'll take questions.